again. Apologies, comrades. That was very odd. Zoom just went down internationally in a panic about Steve Freeman introducing Lenin. So it seems it's working again. So Steve's going to start again from the beginning, but in a shorter version at the beginning, perhaps racing through the first few minutes. So we won't be finished by 7:30, but that's okay, I think. So we aiming for about 8ish. So
Trying
thank you for joining us again.
Here we go again. There's the 8 points I want to cover. I just wanted to say, by way of introduction, that there is no way I felt as I was trying to get to grips with this, the work of probably the greatest revolutionary of the 20th century. I thought there's no way I could encompass all this in half an hour. I'm not even going to try that. I will start with a few biographical points, which you may well know, before getting down to Lenin's politics. And I will have quotes on PowerPoints. I'm hoping we can look at those quotes, so that I can, because for me, it's Citizen Lenin in his own words. So I did go on to list, and I will briefly pass over this. I'll be very quick on this, okay? I was just going to briefly list the pamphlets that I reference, especially the ones in red, although we probably won't get as far as State and Revolution. I'm not going to hang about on that now because we are starting. But What is to be Done? 2 Tactics of Social Democracy. The rather strange entitled one, The Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. And State and Revolution. I wanted to begin on April the 19th, 1917, because that's the day when Lenin got up, packed his suitcase, had his muesli, and then he caught a train. And it was a Swiss train, and then a German train, and then a Swedish train before arriving at the Finland station in St. Petersburg. And it was on April the 3rd by the Russian calendar. And as we say, the rest is history. And I think that the rest of that history will be what we might have in some discussion. But I want to say one thing. He was born a subject of the Tsar of all the Russias. And when he stepped off the train, he was a citizen of a new Russian republic. He was born in Russia in Simbirsk in 1870. And in 1887, when he was 17, his brother was executed. And people say that was a very important point in turning him towards revolutionary politics. In 1887, between 1887 and 1895, he went to St. Petersburg and was active as a revolutionary in the Emancipation of Labor Group. Then he was arrested and exiled to Siberia, and he was there for 5 years. And then after that, he left Russia, and he was exiled from 1900 to 1917, when he got on his train and came back to the Finland station. We could say quite a few things about him as an individual, but as well as being one of the greatest political leaders of the 20th century, he was a fitness fanatic. He did enjoy competition, skating, swimming, running, in drafts and chess, and he loved walking. And he was a scholar whose favorite pastime was reading Latin. I didn't know that point. He was a speed reader with a photographic memory for facts and figures, and he spoke 3 languages. I'm going to describe him as a citizen of Russia and a comrade of the world. And I'm going to say something maybe slightly controversial, to say that Lenin could be seen as being a patriot. Nobody would ever think of calling him that, really, I don't think. But if you read Lenin's writings and what he said, you could see why that makes a certain amount of sense. As a patriot, he loved Russia. He loved the people of Russia, the workers and the peasants. And he hated he hated what he called Great Russian chauvinism, which he associated with the Tsar, with the landlords, with the Black Hundreds, the fascist gangs, the bankers and the capitalists. And as a Russian patriot, he was a deadly enemy of Great Russian chauvinism, and he spoke about freedom always for the Poles, for the Finns, for the Ukrainians, the Georgians, and other nations that were the prisoners of the Tsarist Empire. And as an internationalist, as well as being involved in international organizations and ultimately setting up the Third Communist International and other such things, as an internationalist, he opposed all imperialist wars, not least the Great War of 1914, and as a patriot and an internationalist, he opposed Russia's involvement in that war. They called him, by the way, a German agent or something like that. The Tsarists did. If patriotism is love of Russia's workers and peasants, then obviously you would totally oppose them being slaughtered in a bloody imperialist war to exploit people and enslave other nations. And of course, Lenin is known and very much seen as a party man. His whole political life was seen in terms of building a party that led him through various splits and various reorganizations, from the League for the struggle of the emancipation of labor, through the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the splits they had, the Bolshevik Party after 1912, the Communist Party after the Communist Party brackets Bolsheviks, as they call themselves, after 1918. My first question, however, is to examine Lenin's politics. And I thought I would begin by asking whether Lenin was a Leninist. And I'm going to say that he wasn't. He wasn't. I'll say that he wasn't a Leninist. Okay, he wasn't a Leninist. But in a certain spirit, you know, and I would say I'm not a Leninist either. I know some people already know that. I'm not a Leninist, but of course, Marx said, I'm not a Marxist. And I see that as a rejection of the cult of the personality. We do not have gods, heroes, or cults. Socialism is a science, not a religion. And when Lenin died in 1924, his body spent a month in a month-long embalming process before being placed in a permanent mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. I think it was Stalinism that manufactured Leninism, and Lenin himself would have been horrified to have thought that would have happened to him. My thesis is, the thesis I'm going to put forward, I'm going to argue, is that we could see Lenin as a Republican socialist and a communist. And I'm going to look for some of the evidence to show that in what I'm going to say. First, I'm going to explain that thesis, and then I'm going to mount the evidence to suggest that that's true. By actually quoting Lenin's writings. It's important, I think, to understand the term Republican Socialist, because it's a political and economic term. I mean, you could say, well, in a sense, the term Republican refers to the political side concerned with politics, the state, the constitution and government, whereas socialism refers to economics and in particular the ownership of property. Economism, by the way, as we'll come on to in a minute, is ignoring the Republican side and reducing politics to economics. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But also Republican socialism is not simply a description, but a strategy, the Republican road to socialism. And Lenin led the world on the Republican road to socialism. And when Lenin stepped off the train in the Finland station, he continued along the Republican road right up to the October uprising, which established the world's first democratic and social republic based on an alliance of the workers and peasants and soldiers. So that makes a certain sense. So I know that if we're in England, the term Republican socialism is a bit of an alien term. You know, we're a bit of a Republican free zone here. But if we're in Ireland and Scotland, when we have James Connolly, a Republican socialist, or John Maclean as a Republican socialist, it wouldn't seem such a strange thing to say. Lenin did not call himself, by the way, a Republican socialist. He called himself a Marxist. He called himself a social democrat, and he called himself a communist. So obviously I will take what he said about himself rather than what I'm saying about him. But I would begin with something that we were doing, but I'll begin to take that argument by, I'll begin with Marx and Engels, and a thesis that we've been looking at in the Republican Labour Working Group is called Citizen Marx. And it's written by Bruno Leopold. And the thesis, which is called Citizen Marx, is that Marx began his political evolution as a Republican through the young Hegelians. He was a left Republican, a critical supporter of Republican ideas. Then he discovered the working class and became a socialist or communist rather than a Republican, kind of rejected his earlier views. Then later on, he found a new republicanism at the time of the Paris Commune and integrated it with his communism. So the dialectics of Marx thought began with a Republican thesis, and this met its antithesis in communism, and then we arrive at a synthesis, which could be called Republican socialism or communism. Republican socialism and communism, the difference between those we could be. Lenin did not repeat Marx's, he didn't go through the whole thing of becoming a Republican first of all. He didn't repeat, he stood on the shoulders of Marx and Engels and their ideas about republicanism and social democracy and took it further. Lenin was a Republican, but a particular kind of Republican, a working class Republican. Now, a working class Republican. Lenin was himself middle class by background, as were Marx and Engels. So being a working class Republican is not a personal description about an individual, but a collective term for class politics. Marx, Engels, and indeed Tony Benn, who wouldn't claim to be a Marxist or be influenced by him, were broadly working class Republicans, even though none of them were personally working class in origin. And so I believe that the correct political label for Lenin's republicanism was as a working class Republican. So moving on, comrades, to my, well, whatever it is, my next point. Democracy versus economism. My first port of call in searching for Lenin's Republican socialism is his pamphlet, What is to be Done? Okay, written 1901, 1902. It's a struggle that broke out in the Russian revolutionary movement between the Democrats and the economists. And Lenin social democrat was considered to be a working class democrat, and the term democracy had real meaning. It meant being a consistent democrat. It meant being an extreme democrat. It meant being a militant, radical, revolutionary democrat. And so a social democrat was somebody who took up all the democratic questions in a militant and revolutionary way. These democratic questions would include many questions, such as the case for a republic, the right to vote, the right of nations to self-determination, ending colonies, popular sovereignty, freeing slaves, the right to strike, women's rights, demands for freedom and equality between citizens, ending discrimination, having a secular state. All these questions are constitutional issues about the basic laws of any society. And therefore, democratic republicanism is only one element of all those lists of democratic issues and demands. But what's interesting about it is it's in many ways the overarching one, because it's about the form of government and the form of class rule that we have in a society. And so in What is to be Done, Lenin has this Lenin is arguing as a Democrat against the economists. And that's the essence of what it is. He's arguing about other things in what's to be done as well, about the nature of party organization, but I'm going to concentrate on this bit at the beginning. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin sets up this argument between what he calls social democratic politics and trade union politics. People obviously sometimes don't understand the difference. Economism is trade union politics. Syndicalism might be one expression of that. Whereas social democratic politics is about having about political struggle with political aims and political demands. And in making his case for social democratic politics, Lenin argues that the working class is the vanguard fighter for democracy. That's a term he uses. And if the working class is the vanguard fighter for democracy, that's what working class social democratic politics is about, then it comes to the case that the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, is not the political wing of the trade unions, but a party with its own independent aims and program. And that independent aims and program have to be worked out not from the spontaneous struggle of the working class, but from the whole history and science of working class politics. That's why the program is important. And so Lenin goes on to develop this argument. He says, of course, the economists who concentrate on trade union politics, they don't ignore politics. Of course they don't. They do, but the politics that they come forward with is a very limited kind of politics. And so Lenin then, in this pamphlet, contrasts a trade union secretary with what he calls the tribune of the people. Okay, the trade is not that, he says, you know, the ideal of social democratic politics is not the trade union secretary, but the tribune of the people. And he has, there's a quote where he sort of explains what that means. Of course, it's worthwhile remembering that the tribune of the people is a reference to the Roman Republic, where the people were elected as tribunes to give voice to all the grievances of the oppressed people. And these tribunes had power to convene and preside over what they call it the concilium plebis, the people's assembly, and propose laws and intervene in behalf of the plebeians in legal matters. They were the kind of shop stewards of the people, I suppose. And so Lenin is using that historical reference to the Roman Republic, the tribune, which I think for him means the party. He says here, the party is, and this is how he describes it, the party is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears and no matter what stratum or class of people it affects. And at one point he says, even if you saw a priest being beaten up by the Tsarist police, and you might hate priests, but you would go and defend that priest being beaten up by the Tsarist police if that happened. No matter what stratum or class of people it affects, who is able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation. And he then says, and set forth before all his socialist convictions and, importantly, his democratic demands. And so quite clearly, democracy is figuring strongly in this. And Lenin has another quote, which I think the same thing, to emphasize this point. Lenin says, well, he says he, but I put a he and a she in there. But anyway, Lenin says, is no social democrat who forgets in practice his obligations or her obligations to be ahead of all in raising, accentuating, and solving every general democratic question. So this is what Lenin is talking about, not an economistic party, but one that is actually the vanguard of the struggle for democracy. The one that isn't at the rear guard, sheepishly wondering what to say, is coming forward in a bold way raising, accentuating, and solving every general democratic question. And that's the essential argument that Lenin has for social democracy being working class democracy, being working class republicanism in that sense. Now I'm going to cut out the next bit, which I was going to talk. You can talk about economism, tailism, and spontaneity. There's other things that Lenin addresses in this pamphlet, but I'm just to keep us on time, I'm going to remove that. So what I'm going to go to next from that is I'm going to go to the idea of a democratic and social republic, the next idea that's important. And we can refer here to the 1903 program of the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And of course, if we're going to win a republic, then we have to have a Republican Party, and we have to organize a class struggle for a republic. A mass Republican Party does not start with mass support. It begins with a Republican program and goes on to build a mass party to achieve it, and then ultimately to prevent the restoration of or counter-revolution against it. And Lenin called, and this program that the RSDLP had is called a minimum program, which Lenin describes it as a program of immediate political and economic reforms, which on one hand can be realized on the basis of the existing social and economic relations. In other words, it's not an idealistic program, it's things that can be done right now. And on the other hand, he says, are requisite for the next step forward for the achievement of socialism. The next step forward for the achievement. In other words, one could think of this minimum program of achievable reforms, does not abolish capitalism, but is a necessary step towards socialism. And in this sense, the minimum program, which is often set up against the transitional program, I think that's wrong. A minimum program is a kind of transitional program. To get the revolutionary movement going and mobilized in this way. And so when you look at the program itself, it says, right, the key bit after the preamble of the program, it says, therefore, the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party takes it as its most immediate political task the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy and the replacement by a democratic republic, the constitution of which will it ensure. And then it goes on, of course, into, I think we can see it in two main sections. The first section of this program, okay, the first section of this program, sorry, just looking for where the first section is the democratic section of the program. Number one demand says, for example, we're for the sovereignty of the people, the concentration of supreme state power wholly in the hands of a legislative assembly of representatives of the people. It goes on to talk about number two, universal, equal, and direct suffrage, and goes on to talk about the importance of local self-government for all citizens. It goes on to talk about unrestricted freedom of conscience, speech, publication, assembly, freedom to strike, and freedom of association. So there's a whole series of, in the democratic section, of democratic and republican demands. And then the later sections, there's two parts of it. One you could call, you might say this is the social, because I said a democratic and social report. The social section starts to talk about the position of the working class. And it speaks about, for example, in this working class section, it speaks about the limitation of the working day to 8 hours in every 24 for all wage workers. It talks about legal provision for a weekly rest period to last continuously, for not less than 42 hours for wage workers of both sexes in all branches of industry. It talks about the complete ban on overtime, and I think it's nighttime work as well. So there's a section which is reforms that the working class would need reforms, that progressive reforms for the working class. And then the other section is directed to the peasants, the peasantry. And it says in there, in order to eliminate the survivals of serfdom, which weigh a heavy burden directly upon the peasants, and in the interest of the free development of the class struggle in the countryside, the party demands, and it goes on with a whole series of demands, the cancellation of redemption and quit rent payments, the repeal of all laws that restricts peasants' freedom to dispose of their land, and so on and so forth. So this program is hugely important to understand what the RSDLP is all about. Okay, and Lenin obviously advocates this. Now, I wanted to move on, and I think my next point, if I could, hope I'm not going too fast. Tina?
Sorry, all good.
Yeah, okay, right. So I'm going to move on to the next bit, which is I'm going to talk about the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks next, a little bit about them. The struggle between democracy and economism, that fight continues. The old divide of Democrats runs in parallel with the divide in the RSDLP between the Bolsheviks and the Menshevik wings of the party, because the two wings of the party fall out and split in the 1903 conference. The Bolsheviks called themselves the political wing. They call themselves the political wing of Marxists because they emphasize the political tasks. They were called the Jacobins of Russian social democracy, with reference, of course, historic reference to the Jacobins, the most militant and revolutionary republicans in the French Revolution. The Mensheviks were also republicans, just because they had the same program. They didn't differ over the program. They were republicans as well. But they were infected by this virus of economism. They were always softening their republicanism and retreating towards what we might call Labourism. The British Labour Party was the destination towards which the Mensheviks were heading. So yes, said the Mensheviks, the Tsar is a terrible autocrat and we want a republic. But if we could get a compromise and establish a constitutional monarchy like Britain, then we could build up a trade union movement and strengthen the working class, just like the British Labour Party has done. So they're sort of sliding a little bit away from this more militant democratic and revolutionary politics of the Bolsheviks in another direction. Okay? Retreating towards Labourism. So let's then go on to the next point. If I can quickly see what happens. So let's look at revolutionary republicanism in 1905, the revolution that took place in 1905, 1906. And I think we can see let's hold on a minute. This was seen, the revolution of 1905 was seen by both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks as identified as a democratic, not a socialist revolution. And so there were two views about this revolution, but they all believed that it would bring more capitalism to Russia. The revolution is identified as a democratic revolution, not a socialist revolution. And so what the democratic revolution would do is it would clear away the Tsarist regime, and that would benefit the capitalist class and the development of capitalism in Russia. But Lenin is very clear that a democratic revolution is also in the interests of the working class, because he argues that the more radical and democratic and revolutionary the revolution is, the greater will be the political development, the political understanding, the political consciousness and class organization of the working class. So even though you could say this is a bourgeois revolution, Lenin thought the working class and the Bolshevik wing thought the working class would be beneficial. So one outcome of the democratic revolution may be a capitalist government facing a new working class, more organized, more politically advanced, and more ready to continue the class struggle at a higher level. Now, of course, the capitalists and the capitalist class understood this. They're not stupid. They could see the danger. So they didn't want such a democratic outcome. So their fear of the working class, their fear of the politicization of the working class meant that they didn't really want a republic. They would rather do a deal with the Tsar behind the backs of the people and have a constitutional monarchy just like Britain. The party that represented the liberal progressive bourgeoisie was called the Cadet Party. And therefore they wanted a reformed constitutional monarchy because that would be better for the capitalist class. Now the RSDLP had one Republican program, but two wings, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And so at the beginning of 1905, the 1905 revolution, this division between them, both Republican parts of the party, sharpened into two rival tactics. These two tactics are what was the name of Lenin's pamphlet, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in a Democratic Revolution. And there's a lot of republicanism in this pamphlet as well, but I won't be able to deal with all that. So the Bolsheviks had a conference, which they called the Third Congress, and they passed resolutions. And the Mensheviks had a conference. I don't know what number of conference theirs was, but anyway, in Lenin's pamphlet, it refers to the Third Congress and the conference. So Lenin is doing a polemic on behalf of the Third Congress against the conference. And so I thought I'd put the resolution of that, the resolution that the Bolsheviks passed at the Third Congress. I'll put that up before you, and it's going to look something like this. Now, I know that is far too much stuff to put on a PowerPoint, but it's better than me. I hope I could just have highlighted it in different colors to try and make it a little bit more readable. But these are three key points that the Third Congress, the Bolshevik Congress of the RSDLP, adapted in their resolution. It says, as you can see there, it's in the both the direct interests of the proletariat and those struggling for the ultimate aims of socialism require the fullest measure. Put that down there. Oh no, I've done that wrong. Sorry. There's something's gone wrong there. Hold on a minute. There it is. Okay, sorry about that. Require the fullest measure of, because I can't read now a bit there, fullest measure of political freedom and consequently the replacement of an autocratic form of government by a democratic republic. The establishment of a democratic republic in Russia is possible only as a result of a victorious popular insurrection or uprising, which is the organ, whose organ is the Provisional Revolutionary Government, which alone is capable of securing complete freedom of agitation during the election campaign and of the convening of a constituent assembly that will express the will of the people, etc. Now you can see in that the three elements are democratic republic, provisional government, provisional republican government, provisional revolutionary government, and the convening of a constituent assembly. What's happening down there? Anyway, oh, sorry, something's gone wrong. Let me go back. There we go. And so it says under the present economic and social order, the democratic revolution, it goes on to point out to the working class, under the present social and economic order, the democratic revolution will not weaken the domination of the bourgeoisie. So a certain juncture is warning the working class that even if the resolution is successful, the bourgeoisie will try and come and take away many of your gains of the revolution. So it's kind of given a warning: don't have any illusions in this revolution, because they're going to come for you afterwards anyway. So what's happening here then is that what we see is that militant republicanism, and this is opposed from the Mensheviks slipping towards a constitutional monarchy. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that in the resolution from the Menshevik conference, they put two things. They say in their resolution that a victory of the revolution will be a provisional government, just like the Bolsheviks said, or, they say, or the convening of a constituent assembly. Now, there's two ways you can get a constituent assembly. One is you have a Republican government that convenes a constituent assembly. And the other way is that the Tsar convenes a constituent assembly, as a hark back to 1848. And that's what the Cadet Party wants. They want the Tsar to call a constituent assembly so that they can spend years talking about a constitution that they never managed to get through. And so the Mensheviks, by putting on a par these two different things, the provisional government on a par, as it were, with the Constituent Assembly, that what they've done is they've opened the door to the Cadet Party, to an alliance between themselves and the Cadet Party, by putting the Constituent Assembly, allowing the idea that we could have a Constituent Assembly, is not by overthrowing the Tsar, but persuading the Tsar to grant a Constituent Assembly. So Lenin goes on to link the Lenin goes on to link the Menshevik tactics to economism, and he says that it duplicates the reasoning that the economists gave before. But Lenin also has opponents, shall we say, from the left, from the anarchists, who are opposing the militant. So militant republicanism of the Bolsheviks is being imposed by the Mensheviks, who are slipping off towards a constitutional monarchy, and opposition from the left by the anarchists. So Lenin has to argue against the left. So and it's a very important argument he puts forward. He puts forward this argument. He says, okay, Lenin answers them in full on page 29 of this pamphlet. He says, replying to the anarchists' objections that we are putting off the socialist revolution, we say we're not putting it off, but we're taking the first steps towards it in the only possible way, ways miss out, along the only correct path, namely the path of a democratic republic. Whoever wants to reach socialism by any other path than that of political democracy will inevitably arrive at conclusions that are absurd and reactionary, both in the economic and political sense. So the left critique was, we want to abolish capitalism. We don't need a republic. Let's not get all this republicanism in our way. Let's just simply abolish capitalism and stop messing about. Let's go fast. The Bolsheviks are delaying us by thinking we're going to have a republic. And then he's replying saying, no, there's only one route we can get there. And that is by fighting to get a republic and proceeding in that direction. And that made, therefore, militant republicanism was therefore essentially what the Bolsheviks concluded from that. Hold on a minute. My conclusion then about the democratic revolution would be this. In conclusion, the 1905 democratic revolution, the Mensheviks and economists start to run away or retreat and moderate their demands, whereas the Bolsheviks are revving up their republicanism to a revolutionary degree. Lenin, from the same premise of democratic revolution, makes this conclusion. He says that the advanced class must formulate its democratic aims all the more boldly, express them all the more sharply and completely, and put forward the immediate slogan of a republic and popularize the idea of the need to establish a provisional revolutionary government and crush the counter-revolution. So when you think it's a democratic revolution, some people go, oh, we don't need to bother with that then. Whereas the Bolshevik, Lenin and the Bolsheviks saying, no, we're gonna up the ante on this. We're gonna go very strongly. We're gonna run it out in its direction towards socialism, the democratic and republican path towards it. Okay, 2 more points, comrades. Just to give you an idea how we're doing here. I don't know what time I started. I don't know how we're doing, but I've got 2 more slides. I mean, just to give you an idea, I've got a couple more slides. So we'll do the next one I'm going to do. Let's move on to, okay. We'll move on to democracy versus imperialism. Okay. In a pamphlet, so we've left 1905 and we've jumped into the First World War, and we've jumped to the massive crisis of capitalism, imperialism that's happening in the shape of the Great War. And Lenin writes a pamphlet called, with a strange title, The Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism. So he sets out in this pamphlet the idea that imperialism and democracy are opposites. Okay, that imperialism and democracy are opposites and opposed to each other, and they are in struggle with each other. And you could say, well, imperialism is related to the bourgeoisie and democracy is related to the working class. So what we've got here is, in imperialism and democracy, we have the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the working class. Not forgetting, of course, that most of the people in the world aren't workers, they're probably peasant farmers, so with that qualification. But the peasant farmers are also being oppressed, and they're fighting for democracy. And of course, Lenin points out that, well, imperialism crushes democracy. It takes democracy. I mean, just think what happens during the war when all your civil liberties are taken away and all the people are dying in the trenches and the military discipline and all the rest of it. So imperialism either crushes democracy by conquering countries, by killing people, or bringing in a military dictatorship. So the impact of imperialism is to crush all democracy. But, says Lenin, democracy fights back and rebels. There are democratic protests. There will be uprisings, democratic uprisings. There will be, we can predict this, there will be movements and democratic revolutions by the people, etc. And so Lenin, he doesn't just look at imperialism, he looks at the opposite of that. And that's why Lenin in 1916 supports the Easter Uprising, because he sees that's exactly what he understands by the dialectic of democracy against imperialism. So a little bit more quotes here. It's what Lenin says about this. You can see, as soon as we're talking democracy, you can start saying imperialism. You can see that Lenin's going to bring in the question of economism. That's the next thing he's going to do. So Lenin says, right, okay. He says this point: imperialism is indisputably the negation of democracy in general, of all democracy, not just one of its demands, national self-determination. So it's not just about Ireland and national self-determination. Everything is being destroyed. And not just one of its demands. Being the negation of democracy in general, imperialism is also the negation of democracy in the national question. It seeks to violate democracy. So that's the point I'm making, that Lenin sets up this dialectic between democracy and imperialism. And then he says that but then he says, and this is the other thing, that the achievement of democracy is, in the same sense and to the same degree, harder under imperialism compared to what went before, as the achievement of a republic, a militia, popular elections, etc. So imperialism makes the struggle for democracy much harder as it's being crushed. Now, this leads us on to say, well, what happens? What's his argument with the imperialist economists about? Well, the imperialist economists oppose the fight for republicanism and democracy. They say, well, what's the point of it? Imperialism has made democracy useless, has corrupted it. It's a kind of defeatism. So there's a trend that's grown up in the face of all the horror of the war. It's like the old economism that Lenin opposed in 1903, but now it attaches itself to the wider idea of imperialism. What's the point of it? And Lenin answers them, and he says to them in response, only those who cannot think straight or have no knowledge of Marxism will conclude. So there's no point in having a republic, no point in freedom of divorce, no point in democracy, no point in self-determination. We might as well give up on all this if you're just an economist. But Marxists know that democracy doesn't abolish class oppression. He's telling us it's not the solution totally, but it only makes the class struggle for more direct, it should say. They're more direct, wider, more open, more pronounced than it is. So the struggle for democracy, winning democracy, winning the battle of democracy, it doesn't end the class struggle. It just makes it more clear what's going on. It's like, you might say it's like removing the fog, removing the confusion, removing the fog. Let's have a look. Right, okay, I'm coming now towards the end, and then hopefully we will get. So I'm coming on to my. So here, democracy is set. The fight for democracy is something that takes place in the dialectic against imperialism. And then the last point, I think, is just to think about the relationship between democracy and socialism that Lenin. That flows from this. And I've got two quotes here which I think get to the essence of what I'm arguing, which is this, and then we'll end. Lenin says that all democracy, so Lenin says all democracy consists in the proclamation and realization of rights, which under capitalism are realizable only to a small degree and only relatively. But without the proclamation of these rights, without the struggle to introduce them now, immediately, without the training of the masses in the spirit of the struggle for socialism is impossible. Without training the masses in the spirit of this struggle, socialism is impossible. So Lenin is saying, we don't have any illusions in democracy here, and yet it's the fight for democracy is absolutely essential if we're going to get ourselves towards socialism. And then my final quote, and I hope I'm drowning with too many quotes, and I'll come up with my final piece of my thesis of Lenin as a Republican socialism, which is this: in the socialist revolution and the rights of nations to self-determination, Lenin says, because it's an argument that's going on in this war, Lenin says it would be a fundamental mistake, I think you can't more than a fundamental mistake, to suppose that the struggle for democracy can divert the proletariat from the socialist revolution or obscure or overshadow it. He says, don't think the fight for democracy takes you away from the struggle for socialism. On the contrary, he says, just as socialism cannot be victorious unless it introduces complete democracy. So the proletariat will be unable to prepare for the victory over the bourgeoisie unless it wages a many-sided, consistent revolutionary struggle for democracy. Consistent here is a very important word. It means we fight on all fronts. We fight all these different democratic struggles. They're all part of one big struggle for democracy. So in a sense, there's a kind of dialectical thing there. The struggle for democracy now leads towards socialism, prepares us for socialism, so that when we arrive, we're able to create a democratic socialistic society. So again, this is a thesis that's gone all the way through. Lenin is preparing himself, this is 1916, for what's going to come next. And I'm sure that comrades have lots of things to say about the Russian Revolution, and I do too. And I'm going to come with my conclusion and say either discussion of the revolution itself will come up in our discussions, or I may have to come back and do another one at some point, but we'll see. So let me end on this point, comrades. My original thesis is that we can best understand Lenin as a social democrat or Republican socialist and communist. That's the politics that we get to in 1917. And I suppose the best place really to understand Lenin's republicanism is the section in State and Revolution that he writes in 1917, where he discusses Marx and Engels' views on a republic and its importance. And maybe on another occasion we could talk about that. So I'm going to go back to the Finland. I'm going to end at the Finland station. So here we are, comrades, back at the Finland station in April 1917. And here is Lenin stepping onto the platform with soldiers and workers and peasants, all cheering and throwing their hats in the air. So over to you, comrades.
I want to go to our room.
Thank you, Steve. Could you stop the screen?
Yes, I'll stop my screen. Let's see if I can stop that. I'll stop it up here.
Thank you very much. So interesting introduction. I think you obviously focused on a few things that are important to you rather than other things that other comrades might find important. But I think you highlighted well the question of the democratic republic, and that was important to Lenin as it was to Marx and Engels, and they took what Marx said on the issue of the democratic republic. He said about always quite clearly, it's not a fetish, you know, there's nothing inherently wonderful about the democratic republic, but it is a form that the state will take under the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he made quite clear that the dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't mean violence or necessarily, you know, he had the sort of similar idea to the Chartists, peacefully if we can, forcefully as if we must. But that under the democratic republic is where the working class will be able to struggle for the higher phase of communism, etc. And that just means the rule of the working class. Dictatorship of the proletariat means rule of the working class. So that's an interesting one. We had Carol's asking why dictatorship at all. As I said, it's for Marx and Engels, they meant that means the rule of the working class instead of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It had a different meaning than dictatorship, as I understand it. There's Hal Draper has written a really interesting book about this, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where he's gone through all the mentions in Marx and Engels and highlights where they talk about it, and none of it refers to any, you know, you need to oppress people, you need to abolish the press, you need to abolish parties, etc. None of that, you know, it is always the widest form of democracy, actually extreme democracy, where the working class is in charge. Not socialism yet, not communism yet, but the transition as such, where the working class is in charge. So this is a really interesting subject, actually, which I think a lot of socialists get wrong, where they think, you know, Marx, Engels, Lenin, they all argued for, you know, it has to be, the revolution has to be bloody, it has to be violent, etc. Lenin at this stage still argued that it doesn't have to be. He changed his tune sometimes, somewhat during and after the Russian Revolution. And it could be argued, and some people have argued, that Rosa Luxemburg was the only person who continued that tradition of looking at the dictatorship of the proletariat as a, you know, it only means the rule of the working class. It doesn't mean particular, you know, the oppression of this class or that class, though you could argue, you know, she died early 1918, so she kind of, you know, wasn't around for, 1919, she wasn't around for much of the Russian Revolution, etc., and wasn't, you know, wasn't involved as such. But it's an interesting discussion on that. There's a couple of people with their hands up. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please put your hands up, and then Steve can reply directly if he wants, or wait for a few contributions. We're trying to finish by 8 o'clock, if that's okay. Tony.
Can I okay.
Oh, sorry. Did you want
to make a comment on what you said? Because I was looking at the chat to see what comrades had said in the chat before I get to. I mean, a way to think about. I mean, I agree with what you said about dictatorship. But you might say that we already living under the dictatorship of the crown, meaning the dictatorship of finance capital. We can have different governments, we can have civil rights and liberties, but the City of London remains in charge of everything for decades and even centuries. It's like the permanent rule of the City of London of finance over our society, and we can still have elements of democracy within it. And I think that's what the term dictatorship, the permanent rule, doesn't mean no rights and liberties. It doesn't mean it in that sense. And I agree with what Tina said about it, by the way. But we're already living under a dictatorship.
Oh, yeah. Tony, then. Tony, you're mute for some reason. Something wrong with your microphone. Can't hear you. I'll try and mute you and then ask you to unmute again. Try now. Can't hear you. Should we take Matthew first? Do you want to try and sort it out? Okay, Matthew, you come in first.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you.
The problem is it's been really chaos this evening with IT between all this Zoom issue. Unfortunately, but the thing is, I think Steve's presented a pretty one-sided view of Lenin. Really, I think there's a lot else really of real significance. Certainly for me, I think there's a bunch of stuff really he's left out. I mean, first of all, of course, he was the man of the party. He actually organised, the great instrument of the revolution, the Bolshevik Party, and I think to say Steve goes through some of the questions that were in the Second Congress, which of course was actually the founding Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, because the first one was broken up by the police because it was held in Russia. So in fact, the founding Congress was the second, which was held in Brussels and London. But the point was that the arguments were very unclear, even to the participants. Nobody actually understood what the significance of some of these arguments were at the time, or until 2 years later. And there was a wide variety of different opinions and tendencies. The tendencies. The Bund actually left. For instance, the Jewish organization, the Bund, was and they walked out, the Mensheviks. You had obviously the economists, the people around Martov. You had Trotsky, who actually sided with the Mensheviks at the time. So there was a whole series of different tendencies and so on. It was very confused. And the thing really was that Lenin was able to build an organization, a real one, which actually contained all these different, and a revolutionary organization which contained all these different factions and so on, and had a live debate, which is in contrast to the organizations what we see at the moment, of course, where anybody shows even the vaguest notion of opposing anything put forward by the anointed leaders, they get expelled. So, it's a different type of organization, one which contains an actual, real, series of debates and on life and death issues. I mean, the Bolshevik Party contained this massive debate around the war, in 1918, in which, they were completely opposed, over whether should they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That's incredible. So there's that, and I think there are a number of other things also. I mean, Lenin also emphasizes his study of philosophy, the fact that that to understand Marx you have to understand Hegel, because obviously Marx is a Hegelian in his origin, and therefore if you want to understand Marxism you have to understand Hegel. So he writes an entire piece on the big long study of Hegel. I think in terms of 1905, I mean, Lenin actually went back to Russia for some months in 1905, like everybody else. I mean, most of the Russian revolutionaries went back to Russia in 1905 because they could, and you would under those conditions. But the key development in 1905 is the Soviet. It's the fact the working class actually produces its own organ of power, which is completely different, and is a challenge to the state and the ruling class. It's actually this thing which is precisely the worker's instrument of its own power, which is then you can quite clearly see that becomes vital. And you could see, for instance, the difference between 1905 when you have Soviets and say Spain in 1936 when there are no Soviets. You know, this is a vital thing, and it's then you know the reaction to those Soviets, and of course the Bolsheviks were late to the Soviets, you know, because they saw that the power should be devolved to them, to the party, and in fact, of course, it went to the Soviets, and it was Trotsky who understood the Soviets first, and therefore wound up leading the Petrograd Soviet. And then, of course, it's whole question. There's a couple of other questions really vital. I mean, you know, the first, then, of course, is the whole questions Steve poses one half of, which is the question of, well, is it a bourgeois revolution or a workers' revolution? And it is precisely Trotsky's permanent revolution, in which he and Parvus say, well, obviously the capitalist class has actually now refused to take up even its own historic duty to remove Tsarism and instate its own regime, and in fact has fallen behind the Tsarist regime. And now that job actually falls to the working class. And it's actually that the point being, of course, is that then is accepted by Lenin in the April Theses. If you look at April Theses, it's actually an acceptance. Although Lenin, of course, said he never read Permanent Revolution until after the Russian Revolution. I don't know whether that's true or not. But the April Theses are actually, you know, precisely that, the acceptance that, you know, okay, we've overthrown Tsarism, but the question is, must be a workers' revolution. We must dispose of the capitalist class. We must have a workers' revolution. The first real one. Okay, you had, you know, the harbinger of the Paris Commune, and it's that actually that makes the great event, you know, the Russian Revolution, the most important event in history. I think the other thing is actually also, of course, his opposition to the First World War and the destruction of the Second International. The destruction, the Second International breaks, of course, on the basis of, you know, first of all, the question of do you support your own ruling class, which of course then of course, and the SPD voting war credits, which of course Lenin thought this was forged. I mean, the first copy of Vorwärts, the SPD's newspaper he thought it was a forgery because he couldn't believe it, you know, famously. But it was the opposition to the First World War, which is critical, and then of course his precise point about the First World War, which then of course you know he's then a subject of a huge argument in terms of, he says, well, turn the war, the imperialist war, into civil war, that it actually raises on question of class power, and that versus the pacifists. And this is the dispute in Zimmerwald and Kirnthal between those who support Lenin, who say, you know, the likes of him and Luxemburg and Liebknecht, saying, okay, well, we must you know, seek to overthrow the capitalists under these conditions of this monstrous butchery, and those who are pacifists, the likes of, you know, Keir Hardie, or, you know, actually later on the Kautsky and so on in Germany. So there's all of these different political points you need to draw out. Lenin is obviously very, very complex character, but of course writes all this stuff as basically as notes and so on to his, and pamphlets to showing his political progress. It doesn't actually write a substantial political thesis or book. You know, it all tends to be pamphlets. But I really think Steve is only emphasising certain bits of Lenin. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Do you want to reply to?
Well, of course, there's lots of. I mean, there's massive gaps in everything I said. I wouldn't try to, you know, as I tried to say at the very beginning, we can't cover it all. I'll leave something for Matthew to say and come back. And I did stop it. I did stop in the Finland station anyway. And a heck of a lot's to be learned of that period. It's not that I didn't think it's important. It would have gone on forever. If we'd have gone on for another 2 or 3 hours if we're going to do that. So I think we should discuss Lenin in the actual Russian Revolution in 1917, And I don't disagree with the points that Matthew said about, is it the thing, you know, Matthew filled in some other gaps, but I don't think it knocks my basic thesis. It just puts more, that Lenin has more stuff to say and more things to do, and there were more things you could emphasize in, but I don't think it doesn't knock that thesis. It just fills in stuff, really. And I hope comrades will fill in more stuff. You know what I mean?
Yes, thank you. Tony, do you think your mic works now? No, it still doesn't. Do you want to go out and come back in or something? Still doesn't. Nope. Afraid not. Do you want to leave the meeting and try and come back in? Sorry. Okay, Cheryl, you've got your hand up, but I think that might be a not on purpose. Yes, it's down. Oh, back up. No, that was a mistake. Does anybody else want to come in? So please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. The question of the Soviets versus Constituent Assembly is perhaps interesting. And perhaps you want to speak about that a bit more, perhaps? Do you want to say something on that, Steve?
Well, yeah, the fundamental problem, I think, of the Russian, and I would call it a democratic revolution, the Russian democratic revolution, was that the vast majority of the people were peasants. Yeah. And that was always going to be a problem. I mean, there were two things that they needed for that revolution to succeed. They needed the support of the working class in the rest of Europe, and they nearly got it. Because of the crisis of the war, they did sort of get it, but it didn't survive very long. So they were a bit stuck without the German working class. And then in a peasant economy, where most, and the problem with peasant economies is the peasants under capitalism are a class that's going to disappear. You know, what's going to happen is that capitalism and agriculture is going to eventually destroy the peasantry, and they're going to convert them, and some of them are going to go to the cities and become surplus labor in the cities, and others of them are going to become little capitalists in the countryside. So you're dealing with a class with no future, and yet that class is quite conservative for all sorts of other reasons. So the revolution has got a problem with that. And if you have the problem with the Constituent Assembly is that the Bolsheviks were going to be, the peasant parties were going to do a heck of a lot. So you were either going to shut down the democracy, you know, or find some way of making a deal with the peasantry. And so that was a fundamental problem. So the Bolsheviks had power. Well, when they had the elections to the Constituent Assembly, the peasant parties did a lot better than they did. And I don't know whether there was a kind of an obvious sort of answer to that particular problem. Simply substituting the dictatorship of the proletariat didn't really get to it. But in any case, at that point, they were about to be invaded from all over the place as well. The Civil War was about to begin. There was a whole heap of other things. So there were some really fundamental problems that they had to deal with, which ultimately, I think, sank them. But they did manage to win the Civil War, and they did manage to do that by getting a lot of the peasantry on their side. So I don't think they could have won the Civil War if the Red Army if the White Armies hadn't really frightened and pissed off the peasantry to such a degree that the Red Armies could have that mass support. You know, they got that back by winning that Civil War, but it still left them in a heck of a mess. And I think that's the problem with a revolution that doesn't go beyond its own borders. And I think, you know, Lenin knew that, Trotsky knew that, they all knew that. But what do you do? And my only thing is that if you can preserve a democracy at that point, then you can preserve working class power. If the democracy is destroyed, then really the working class just turns back into wage slaves again under Stalin's regime.
Yeah, there was also the problem, of course, of the German working class.
Yes,
not
exactly.
making revolution, which is what Lenin always said. Unless the Germans make revolution, we're baguette. He didn't use the word baguette, but
exactly that. Yeah, he could have done it. He could have used that word, and it would have still worked.
Yeah. Okay. Let's try Tony again, but I think he's still got the same problem. Yeah, you're still mute. Tony, do you want to put your question perhaps in the chat, if it is a question or comment? I was going to mention the Patriot thing. I think you mentioned that in the chat. I think you're right about that one. He disagrees with your assessment that Lenin would have thought of himself as a patriot. Patriot being, of course, putting nationality above class, and putting everybody into the same boat. I love all Russians, or
He didn't do that though, Tina. I mean, I did try to make that point. He didn't do that. When you read there's a book, there's an article or pamphlet he wrote on the Great Russians, and he doesn't do that. He says, I mean, I'll go look it up because I didn't have it to hand, but he does say that you shouldn't just let the ruling class be the voice of the nation. You know what I mean? They can claim they're the patriots, but no. What we should do is thinking of it in class. We should be thinking of patriotism much more in class terms, and we can do that. We don't have to hand all the patriotism over to the right-wing reactionaries. We don't have to do it in that way. You can. It doesn't mean you're not if you're a patriot, it doesn't mean you're not an internationalist. I mean, most patriots are chauvinists. They're great chauvinists. I understand that point, and it's a right-wing thing. But it doesn't have to be like that. And Lenin, I think I'll have to dig it out, the quotes, Tina, but Lenin didn't look at it like that.
And you're saying he actually described himself as a patriot?
I don't know if he did, but he said he spoke about. I will after this is over, Tina. I shall go and dig out the article just to remind myself of what he said.
I think another subject you mentioned, which could briefly talk about, because there's no other hands up and Tony's doesn't work, is the minimum, maximum, and the transitional program,
Yes.
which is an interesting question.
Yes.
And I kind of agree with you that the minimum program and the sort of official communist tradition is very similar to the transitional program of the Trotskyist tradition.
Yes.
But in addition, obviously, the communists have the maximum program, and
Yes.
and say we should always mention that. And I think that is a really important point. Even today, when we're talking about enough is enough or don't pay and all these movements that are going on, will they move anywhere? Which direction do they move? And I think that is a problem if you don't have the maximum program as well. It doesn't mean you just stand on the sideline and shout socialism, but you have the minimum as well as the maximum. You're saying, unless we know our aim, we're going to get lost. If we just have minimum demands, transitional demands, you can get lost on the way of supporting this or that movement, which can go in all sorts of directions. How do you see that?
Well, first of all, I think the idea of a minimum program as a transitional program, in other words, not an end in itself. I think that just the minimum versus maximum is a slightly false thing. I think we should learn that that's not the case. I think the minimum program is a Republican program that leads you into a republic, and through practical reforms. The whole point about the minimum program, they weren't sort of setting up things that the capitalists couldn't give us, so that the capitalists would say, no, you can't have them, and then we'd start a revolution in response. No, Lenin was saying, we will carry out these things. We're actually determined to carry out these reforms. They're all achievable. We can have democratic rights. We can have a republic. We can have a constituent assembly. We can have an 8-hour day or whatever hours we want to have these days. All these things are achievable. And the working class will understand that and will support it. They won't understand it if they think we're trying to trick them by thinking up things the capitalists won't give us in order to trick people into revolution. So I think that idea is very sound. It is a reform program, but it's a revolutionary program, Tina. That's the point. It leads you towards a revolution. But then what happened was that when they moved into that republic, when we got over into the republic, a new kind of transitional program was necessary. And Lenin wrote that in The Impending Catastrophe and How to Fight It. He said that now we're in a hell of a mess. We've got this republic. We've got the capitalists who are still trying to wage the war. The only way we're going to get out of this is we nationalize the banks. We do all these things that you think of in a transitional program. And the only way we can do that is if we transfer power to the Soviets. So I think minimum program is like transitional program number one, and then that goes away, and then you have to, when the revolution has begun, you come back with you have another one. That's the lesson that Lenin adopted, a different sort of program in the middle of the revolution, because he recognized they were in a different thing. And I think that if where we are today in this country, a minimum program still works. Now, the thing about a minimum program is the minimum program could be supported by reformists and revolutionaries. But as you say quite rightly, Tina, If you're a socialist or a communist could support a minimum program. But as a communist, you'd have to say that we cannot solve the world's problems in one country. We need a global solution. And you start to argue, you would have to make a case for global solutions to the problems of the world. And that's what I think the maximum program is about. But the thing is, you can unite. Corbyn united a large number of people around a reformist program. It wasn't a minimum program. That's the whole point about it. Whereas a minimum program is different. It is practical in the way that the Corbyn program was, but it's not limited itself to working within the political system that we've got. So I think the minimum program is still relevant today, but learning that we would need a transitional program only in a revolution. We're not in a revolution. We're not ourselves in a revolution at the moment.
No, but you can always mention, that.
You can.
Mention.
Yeah.
Okay, Cheryl.
Well, I said you can mention it. I just said, we haven't got, but I'm just saying we should be telling people that capitalism is a global system, and we need we need communism as a global solution to the problems of capitalism, and we can't solve the problems of capitalism in one country. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything in one country. Well, we've got to wait until the world sorts itself out. So it's an articulation between the global and the national.
Cheryl, sorry, you had your hand up right at the beginning, and I thought it was a mistake, but then it goes up and down, up and down. So now.
Oh, I do apologise. I thought. Anyway, yeah, my question is about the role of the party. Friends of mine who are anarchists would argue that if you have a party, it often replicates a sort of bourgeois hierarchical structure, and therefore what you're doing is just reinforcing something that is already present in a bourgeois society. And I can see from sort of being in, early days, spending time in Nicaragua during just after the revolution, how that can happen, and there's kind of leaders, and then it forms another hierarchy that seems to sort of replicate a sort of undemocratic structure, if you like. And so it's just a question about the role of the party and how you compare that with ideas about, I think it's called Confederate socialism, as Öcalan writes about, in terms of there are different ways to challenge a bourgeois society other than through having a party. I didn't articulate that very well, but I tried my best.
I think we know what you mean, obviously. How to avoid, a party becoming a sect, and
with a hierarchical structure that just kind of replicates another form of oppression. Yeah.
I mean, I say, while we live in a capitalist society where the main form of managing everybody is bureaucracy, while bureaucracy is deeply rooted in our culture rather than democracy, then it's absolutely true that any party can become a bureaucracy, maybe starts as a bureaucracy, and there's a danger of it. And you can't solve it in one party, unfortunately. It's a way in which you can fight. If you can fight to solve it in the society, then you can solve it in the party. So it's always, bureaucracy is always, democracy is possible and it's necessary. But it doesn't mean to say we get it. So in a way that what we have to do is have a very strong democratic consciousness, a very strong democratic culture, understand the importance of democracy, which is what I see in Lenin, all of Lenin, especially State and Revolution, the importance of democracy to get us to socialism. And in that struggle, we may be defeated, we may be overcome by bureaucracy. There's no magic sort of bullet that can stop anything other than us collectively understanding the importance of democracy in the party. But you can't have it. I mean,
I'm questioning. I suppose what I'm doing is questioning the need to have the party at all, whether there can be ways of organising and challenging power without there being a need for a party, because the formation of a party in itself is problematic. I think
But
that's
that's an interesting question when you look at the Russian Revolution. Could it have happened as it did without the Bolsheviks there? And I think you've had throughout history revolutions which went first stage, like it happened in Russia, and then they stopped. You know, the first stage you got rid of the old order, but you didn't, nobody was there to follow it through the second stage. And I think that's where the Bolsheviks played an incredibly important role in seeing that through. And I think for that you do need the working class. I think the difference that what the Bolsheviks try to do is what they call democratic centralism, which worked to a degree, which is you have unity in action. You know, when you decided on an action, you're all united. But before that and afterward, you have freedom of debate and you can disagree. And if you read some of the polemics between Lenin and his comrades, they're calling each other all sorts of names. It is quite nasty, comradely, but nasty. And they have it all out in the open and they're disagreeing about tactics and this and that. And they have it in their party press, unlike anything the sects today on the left in Britain or elsewhere would do, you know, where you have to one party, one line. They had the total opposite. They had a very democratic culture and a very vibrant culture of debate in the party press, which is something I think we can all learn from. Steve.
Yeah, I just to say that it's about if the working class is going to be influence the revolution as opposed to just simply watch it happen, just applaud. If it's going to influence the revolution, it needs organization to be able to do that. Because the ruling class has all the organization, it has all the guns, it has all the bureaucrats, it has all the secret services and all these other things. It's super organized. The working class might be a majority, but the working class are disorganized in one sense, and they're not politically organized. And so the whole idea was the working class cannot win unless it gets organized with the best politics and the best people in a democratic way, with the best kind of ideas that it can get together. And only then can the working class have a chance, only a chance of doing it. Because in Sri Lanka or maybe in Iran, I think if there's no Workers' Party there, we can imagine what's going to happen. It isn't going to succeed. It's like if we had a revolution here, and we didn't have a real party organization. The winners of the revolution, I can tell you right now, the victors will be the Tories. You know what I mean? We'll have a revolution. We'll think it's going well, and then at the end of the day, the party that wins will be the Tories because they're always winning everything. So the bourgeoisie and the Tories will win. And so we need a counter to that. We have to put an alternative.
No, I understand that, but I think you're missing my point. I think my point was, can you not organise a challenge without there being a party?
Well, I suppose I mean, okay. I'm not
No.
trying to. I mean, it doesn't matter if we call it a party, if the word party is getting in the way. We need an organisation, and I don't want to fetishize the word party. A political organisation, I think, is what I want to say. Some people don't like parties. I understand that. They think that parties would damage us, but I think that parties are necessary. The problem is if they just become ruled by bureaucrats, as you said at the beginning. That's the problem. The problem is whether the people in the party can fight to make sure the party is democratic.
And you know, organizations like XR or whatever, you know, they say, oh, we're not a party, etc. And then what happens? Somebody's making decisions somewhere. It's just you can't challenge them because there's no transparent structure. So somebody is in charge, you know, and I've heard that plenty from people who wanted to get involved. There's no way you can overturn what they are saying has to be done, you know, and that's not democracy. That's not going to lead the majority of the working class to participate in trying to overthrow capitalism, which is what we need, isn't it? We need the majority with us. We need to convince the majority of the working class that we're democratic, you can join us and you will be heard and you are allowed to disagree, etc. It just has to be a democratic structure. Otherwise you have undemocratic structures and they're much, much worse, I think. Steve, thank you for joining us, Cheryl. Good question.
Yeah.
Can I just read out quickly, because it's 5 to 8 already.
Yeah.
Tony's written quite a lot down.
So I was just searching through the chat to see if I could find out where it was. I saw he'd written something. But
1945 starts. Okay, I'll read it.
Okay.
You can't see the chat. So firstly, the Tsarist autocracy is completely different from capitalist monarchy today. Secondly, Russia was a mainly peasant society, and the need was for the working class to win them over. Third, patriotism is by its very nature cross-class. Steve's argument is by its very nature in opposition to class solidarity. Fourth, imperialism today is a very different creature given the domination of finance capital and the emergence of the US as the main imperialist power. There aren't the same competing imperialisms in the sense that there was over a century ago. Fifth, imperialism in 1917 mainly consisted of colonial rule in its various manifestations, indirect rule, mandates, etc. Today we have a nuclear dominant USA which is fighting a proxy war. 6, I did joke that Steve would shoehorn Lenin into Republican socialism, and sure enough, he did. It goes on somewhere further down. Hold on, I'll read it all out.
Okay.
7th, republicanism was a manifestation of the fight for socialism. It is not a distinct aim in itself. It describes the character of the socialist society they were fighting for, especially as the Tsarist autocracy was a dictatorship of the feudal aristocracy, not the bourgeoisie. 8th, clearly the fight for socialism is a fight for democracy. If it isn't, what are we fighting for? Extreme democracy in every area of society, especially the economy. But a lot of what Steve's saying is simply abstract. I agree on a transitional program. But the question is, what will it be in a situation where there is no mass revolutionary organization? Indeed, the question arises, and this is not ever touched on, as to whether the Western working class is a potentially revolutionary class anymore, given that it is in the third world that exploitation is at its most intense. Steve also doesn't mention the question of national liberation movements and how they stop a limited political independence and the need for a continuing struggle for socialism at a time when the US imperialism lays waste to entire states and societies with its failed states. I think that was it, roughly. So perhaps in replying,
I mean, a lot of this is to do, Tony, I think, with the relevance of, well, some comments said that you turned Lenin into a Republican socialist by quoting all these other things, but really it was the other way around. It was Lenin that turned me into a Republican socialist. When I read him, I realized that we were all economists in this country and we'd got it all wrong. So thanks, Lenin, for making me a Republican socialist and having Tony Greenstein jumping on me all the time. So I blame Lenin for that. Anyway, look, the point is that the question is, any of this stuff relevant today? And I believe a lot of it is relevant today. I don't mean we are the same society as they were in the beginning of the 20th century, but imperialism is still a relevant concept today. Democracy, the struggle for democracy hasn't ended. We've been having democratic revolutions in places like Sri Lanka, Iran, Chile, and places like that, in lots of other places. So the category democratic revolution hasn't died, even though we said, oh, it died because we have got capitalism now. The struggle for democracy is going on around the world. It's happening in America. It's happening in this country. So Lenin's talking about democracy is not abstract. It's highly relevant to today. Now, I wasn't giving an analysis of capitalism today or imperialism today, and you can say that, and it's true. But the fundamental points that I was trying to draw upon is that when Lenin was a social democrat and a communist, the democratic bit is really, really important. And it's the bit that we tend to forget about. And we tend to forget about it here, especially in England, where we don't have our democratic and Republican culture has long since disappeared. And we need it again, because we're facing a major crisis of our democracy, the failing democracy. And you're absolutely true, a constitutional monarchy is not the same as the Tsarist autocracy. But that doesn't mean to say that, well, now that we've got a constitutional monarchy, we've got all the democracy we need, because we clearly haven't. So I think that, yeah, Lenin made me into a Republican socialist. And then I've annoyed Tony because I still think some of Tony's thinking goes down the economistic line, and we can see where the argument between democracy and economism goes. But having said all that, you know, we have to apply all these ideas, try to find out which of them are relevant and use them for today. And I think the idea of a minimum program being a transitional program is very relevant today when we come to deal with the fallout from the Corbyn movement. So I do think that's the case, because we can unite the left on a minimum program. And then Tina can still be a communist and talk about the maximum program in that united front with a broader range of people. All the people that signed up for Corbyn could sign up for this type of minimum Republican program, the type that Tony Benn was doing and the type that Lenin was talking about. So, you know, I think it is relevant today, and it's relevant to the crisis of democracy that we are undergoing. And that's not to say we should copy it all or just think we can easily transform it. It has to be, we have to, as science, we have to apply it to today.
We have to learn some lessons from it.
And I didn't mention, there's a lot of things I didn't mention, Tony, that's fair enough. I didn't mention national liberation. National liberation are really national democratic movements. They are movements of people in particular countries to get rid of colonization or to get rid of oppression. National liberation movements, that's exactly what they're doing. They're Republican movements usually, not necessarily. I mean, Lenin says that he wouldn't support a reactionary movement, but most national liberation movements are which really involve people. The people are not all socialists who come to the national liberation movement, but what they do want is democracy, and that's the one thing that they take seriously and want. And it's for socialists to be able to intersect with that and articulate that in the way that Lenin told us how to do it, basically.
And
with his minimum program, you know.
Yes, and win them over to socialism.
And win them to socialism in the pros.
Champions of democracy for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So, comrades, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Steve. I think that was a very vibrant discussion and opening, and I'm sure there's still people disagreeing, but that's a good thing. You know, we can all discuss together and disagree with each other. Next week, November the 10th, we are taking a break from our series and we're looking at the midterm elections in the US. We're joined by Dan Lazar from the US, and we'll be talking about what that means in terms of the war against Ukraine, etc. Then next year, then we're carrying on with the Lives of the Left series until the end of the year. And then in January, we're starting a new series called What is Socialism? Where we'll be revisiting some of the questions we touched on today. Programs, party building, do we need a party, how should it be structured, etc., etc. So we want to discuss those things in more details, and I think that's all going to sound quite interesting. Okay, comrades, have a good evening. Thanks for coming back after our difficult start today, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.